Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our live stream on Bass Guitar 101. We're going to be talking about electric basses today, the basic things you need to know about electric bass. That's whether you're starting on electric bass. This is going to be geared mostly towards people that are starting out, but there could be something for anybody in this. Or maybe you're transitioning from another instrument. Maybe you're a guitar player transitioning to bass, or drummer transitioning to bass. Whatever it is, we're going to get into the fundamentals of all the gear today. We're focusing on the gear. We're going to be talking about basses. We're going to go in categories. Basses. We're going to talk about the woods that are used to create basses, electronics. We'll talk about strings. And we'll talk about amplifiers, and then at last we'll talk about effects at the end, and some cool effects that you can get to enrich and enhance your bass playing experience. So I've been a bass player for quite a long time. I was originally a drummer, but what happened was we had to move my family from a house into an apartment. So I couldn't take my drums with me into the apartment. But a friend of mine that I've been jamming with, he had a bass, and I had been playing his bass, and I was really enjoying it. I felt like bass was kind of like drums, but with notes. You know, you were still part of the rhythm section. So when we had to make that move, I sold my drums, got into bass, and I've had a great time ever since playing bass, being a professional bass player. I manage Long McQuade Musical Instrument Store in Markham, which is a very bass-oriented store. So please come visit our shop. We've got all kinds of great bass gear, and our staff are very knowledgeable when it comes to bass because they hang around our customers and around me. We have a lot of bass customers coming to our store. I'm very grateful that I became a bass player because as a bass player, you have to carry a lot less equipment. So sorry for the drummers out there. Please do your drummer friends a favor and help them load their gear in and out. They'll be really good friends with you and really appreciate that kind of thing. So let's get into Bass Equipment 101. In each section here, you can ask questions, and at the end of each section, if anything hasn't been answered from what I've already said, then we'll go through those individual questions. So thank you very much for joining us. Let's get into it. Let's start with basses themselves, the instruments themselves. We're going to talk about these two instruments first of all, which are Fender basses. This one is a Squier Precision bass, and this one is a Fender Jazz bass. It's the same company. Squier just makes the entry-level products, and Fender makes the core instrument line, right? So the Fender Precision bass, this beauty right here, was the first electric bass to come out to gain notoriety and popularity. Leo Fender created this electric bass, and up until then, people had been playing acoustic basses. Big bands, jazz bands, those big, giant, upright basses that you play like this. Very cool instrument. But Leo decided, why don't we make something a little bit more simple and embrace the amplification that's being made and make an instrument that's more portable, easier to use, and a heck of a lot less expensive. So he came up with this brilliant design of the Fender P bass. The P in P bass stands for precision bass. So it's the Fender Precision bass. It's probably the most popular bass in the world. It's probably the most recorded bass in the world. Most of the recordings you love and have listened to, there's a high probability that they were recorded on a Fender Precision bass. I remember going to the Beaches Jazz Festival a few years ago, walking up and down the street. I wanted to see what all the bass players were using. I'd say probably 95% of the bass players on the stages were playing Fender Precision basses. You just can't go wrong with a P bass. It can do any style of music, rock, funk, reggae, R&B, soul. It suits pretty much everything. So you really can't go wrong with a Fender P bass. It's stood the test of time, and nearly every electric bass is based off of this instrument, based off of Fender instruments. So let's take a look at what the features are on the Precision bass. So 4-string bass, obviously all basses were 4-string in the beginning. There was a 4-string bass. And then there's a single humbucking pickup. So if you look at this, this is actually two single coil pickups that have been stacked together to create this humbucking. And that's what humbucking is. It's bucking the hum. If you had just one of these pickups, it would be prone to buzzing. And actually the original basses, original Fender P basses did just have a single coil pickup in them, but they tended to buzz with the 60 cycle hum. So they put another single coil, stacked them on top of each other. It eliminated the hum and also changed the sound a little bit, which we'll get into in the electronics part. So it has a single humbucking pickup that Leo put right in the sweet spot. This spot right in the middle here between the neck and the bridge, where there's a lot of roundness, a lot of thickness to the sound, and very simple controls. There's a volume control and there's a tone control. That's all there is to it, a volume and a tone. So not a lot to get lost in, very simple, but very effective. A P bass has a way of just sitting in the right spot of a mix. Whether it's a recording or whether it's a live performance, it can kind of sit in a sweet spot without a lot of EQ. It works. It works over and over again. So I'll play a bass line on it so you can have an idea of what it sounds like, and I'll show you what this tone control does, because the volume is clearly, let's shut off my envelope filter. We'll talk about effects later. Volume is just that. It's going to turn your volume up and down. And here's a bass line. You might know this one. So now we have the tone control. If we were to turn this tone control down, it will make the sound more dull, less bright, a little bit more warm. And I'll be talking in these terms of bright, warm, dark. If we can think of the frequency spectrum of EQ as on the left here we'll have bass with darker sounds, and on the right here we'll have treble, brighter sounds. When we turn the tone knob down, it's just taking some of the edge of the treble down, right? So I'll show you what that sounds like. That's with the tone all the way up, turn the tone all the way down, right? A little bit more muddy, but warmer. And then you can sweep this to find a spot that you like, a sweet spot, where you've got enough treble there, but enough warmth. And that's basically as much tone shaping as you're going to do with the electronics. Any other tone shaping that you're going to do on a precision bass is going to come in from the placement of your hands. Placing the hands back here will give you a tighter sound. Placing your hands closer to the neck will give you a rounder sound. So that's the P bass in a nutshell. So this bass changed the world. It was really made prominent by a fellow named James Jamerson. If you haven't checked out Jamerson and you're getting into bass, check out James Jamerson. There's a documentary called Standing in the Shadows of Motown. He was quite a character, an incredible bass player. So all those Motown recordings that you've heard, Marvin Gaye and so forth, was James Jamerson was on the bass using this electric bass guitar, which he actually got quite a bit of resistance from in the beginning. People didn't want the electric bass. They wanted an acoustic bass. So he really had to push and get in there with it. But once he was in there with it, it changed the world. And everybody wanted that kind of sound for the clarity that it had, the thump that it had, just a beautiful sound, the world's most popular instrument. You can't go wrong with a Fender P bass. So that was going really well. Precision was taking over the world, but Leo wanted to keep inventing and come out with kind of a deluxe version of the precision bass. So he came out with this, which is the Fender Jazz Bass, which of course does not need to be used solely for jazz. Like the P bass, you can use the Jazz Bass for nearly any style of music and it'll work very well. But he did a few things. He took the body, he made it a more asymmetrical with this kind of offset waist to give it a bit of a sportier, funkier look. And he took that single humbucking pickup and he took the two single coils and separated them, pulled them apart from each other in different places, which would give you more tone shaping ability. So on the Jazz Bass, there's a volume for each pickup, and how you combine and work these volumes dramatically changes the sound of it. So there's a lot more tone shaping that can be done. He also made the neck thinner, less wide at the nut. So at the nut, the P bass is much wider. The jazz bass is a little bit more thin. So it's, again, more of a sporty model. It's a little easier to get around with a little bit more control over the tone. And if you ever see one of these, because this is an American original jazz bass, and people see these things, they're like, they don't have them on current models, but when they're doing a new version of a vintage model, this is what Fenders used to come with, and it was called a thumb rest, which used to confuse the heck out of me because I would wonder, how is that a thumb rest if I'm playing with my fingers here? And it's because when electric basses came out, they didn't know that people were going to play them with the fingers. They were thinking they were going to play them with the thumb. So originally people would rest their fingers here and play with their thumb, right? But Jamerson changed that for everybody with his hook, and on it went from there, people playing with their fingers. So I'm going to play that same bass line now, just on the jazz with both pickups open all the way. So both volumes are all the way open, the tone is all the way open, and you'll hear the difference between the jazz and the P bass with the same bass line. Now I'll show you the difference between the two pickups. If I turn this bridge pickup, this is we call this the bridge pickup. This is the neck pickup because it's closer to the neck. If I turn the volume totally off of the bridge pickup, now we're just going to hear the neck pickup. It sounds a little bit more like the P bass now. By soloing, that's what we call it when we're just choosing one pickup, it's called soloing that pickup. It sounds more like the P bass. But now if I turn that the neck pickup all the way off and turn the bridge pickup all the way up, so now I'm soloing the bridge pickup, I'll play the same bass line. It has this tighter sound to it. It's a little bit tighter. It's not as deep. Doesn't have as much bass in it. It's a little thinner sounding, but it's got a lot of attack and a lot of the growl because we're using a single coil pickup and we're playing closer to the bridge. And this is a sound that was made famous by a fellow named Jaco Pastorius, who also, if you're getting into bass and you don't know who Jaco Pastorius is yet, check out Jaco Pastorius. He will blow your mind. He was a virtuoso bass player that played for a band called Weather Report. He took what Jamerson did and took it to a whole new level, and his bass was a Fender jazz bass that he turned into a fretless bass. Other famous jazz bass players would be Marcus Miller, would be another one, and Flea loves a jazz bass. There's actually a Fender signature Flea series jazz bass. And some of the other people that you might know of playing P bass, why have I stumped on his name right now? First of all, Sting is one very well-known person, and Pino Palladino, of course, if you ever checked out the John Mayer Trio. So I always think that that's a good way to help choose a bass guitar. When people come into the store and they're trying to decide what instrument to get, I always ask them, who are your top 3 favorite musicians, like bass players or guitar players if they're picking a guitar, because just knowing who their favorite players are, I get an idea of the sound that they like and know what kind of direction. So that's a good way for you to choose what bass guitar to go with, is look at the basses that are being used by your favorite bass players, and that'll give you a good direction to go in. So these two basses, the Fender P bass and the Fender Jazz bass, change the world. They are a great choice for anybody who's getting into their first bass. And basically any bass that's been made since is based off of these designs. Eventually we'll talk about this F bass here, Fernaletto Instruments. George Fernaletto is a huge fan of the Fender Jazz bass. This is kind of his take, modern take on a Fender Jazz bass. So that's Fender for you. That's basses. I don't see any questions coming up yet specifically on basses, but if you do have a question, throw it up now, because we'll wrap up the bass section in a couple of moments here, and we're going to talk about woods next. Okay, so here's one question. I find my jazz bass sounds really good on the A, D, G strings, lots of clarity and great tone. I find my E string sounds super dull. Doesn't even sound like the same instrument. I have experimented with toe knobs, etc. Still can't dial it into sound any good. Any suggestions? Could it be a problem with the pickups? It's possible. Hard to say, hard for me to say without seeing it. I suggest you take it to a Long McQuade store where they have a good technician. All of our stores have good technicians, but take it to a store and get them to check it out to see what's happening. It is possible that it could be the pull pieces that aren't working right. I don't know if you've changed your strings recently, Daniel. By the way, my name's Dan, if I haven't said that yet. Daniel, nice to meet you. If you haven't changed your strings in a while, get a new set of strings, because if you do a lot of playing on the E string and it gets worn down more, it might not sound as good as the other strings that we don't play as much because we do a lot of playing on the E string. That's just another possible option. So anyways, yeah, check that out. Get your bass checked out for sure, because it shouldn't do that. There shouldn't be that drastic change in brightness or tonality between the strings. So that is Fender basses. A little bit of history and a little explanation on those. Next, we'll talk about wood. Basses are made out of wood, and the wood that a bass is made out of has a significant impact on the tonality of the instrument. And Fender came out with these two main combinations of wood. A lot has been done since. I'm not going to talk about all the woods designed for bass guitars. We can get into that more later at a different webinar. But I'm just going to talk about the most popular combinations. The first most popular combination is alder and rosewood. An alder body with a rosewood fingerboard. Nearly all Fender basses, the neck is made out of maple, but on this we have a rosewood fingerboard and the body is made out of alder. And this gives a very particular sound. An alder body has a lot of warmth to it. So again, if we think of that spectrum of EQ with bass on this end and treble on this end, alder to me kind of sounds a little bit like this. Roll off a little bit of the top end, roll off a little bit of the top end, lots of sweetness in the mid-range, and it's a very resonant sound. It's a very warm sound that you get from alder. And if you think about a player like James Jamerson, he definitely had a very warm sound. The fingerboard is made out of rosewood. Now, rosewood is also a very resonant and warm sounding wood. It's on the darker end of the spectrum. So when you have a bass that has an alder body and a rosewood fretboard, both of those woods are resonant and warm sounding, so you're going to have this kind of resonant, warm sounding bass. Not as much treble, not as much bass, really nice, sweet mid-range. Conversely, they came out with another combination, which is the total opposite end of the spectrum, and I'll pull down this F bass to give you an example. This is an ash body with a maple fingerboard. An ash body has this really pronounced grain. If you see a lot of strong grain in a wood, that's a good indicator that it might be ash, and it has a maple fretboard, which someone is asking about maple, so I'm going to talk about maple in a moment here. So ash is different than alder in that if we think about that spectrum of EQ, if this is the full range and if alder was kind of here with less bass and less treble, ash has more bass and more treble than alder does. So a little bit thicker in the bottom end, a little bit brighter in the top end, but the mid-range is kind of scooped out a little bit, right? So it has this deep lows and bright highs with the mid-range slightly scooped out. It's a very big sounding bass with a lot of attack. So to answer your question, Kiddu, bird's eye maple, that's generally the quality of maple, is it's going to have a lot of attack, a lot of brightness. So it really depends what sound you like. When I think of alder rosewood, I think of James Jamerson. I think of Jaco Pastorius, more of that warm sound. When I think of ash and maple, I think of a bass player like Marcus Miller, who has a very bright sound, more scooped out in the mid-range. And those are the most common wood combinations. Now, of course, Fender started to mix those combinations because they're very much the opposite. So you could have an alder body with a maple fingerboard, which would give you the warmth of the alder with the brightness and sharpness and attack of the maple, which is a combination I love. Alder rosewood, which is what Fender did a lot of in the 70s. Or you could go the opposite way, have an ash body with a rosewood fingerboard, where you're getting the brightness and the support of the ash body, but you're getting the warmth of the rosewood fingerboard. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways these woods can be combined to achieve different tones, but of course you can shape any of those tones as you like by using EQ, right? The way you use your EQ and your electronics, which is what we'll get into next, will shape the sound of your bass. But the way I like to think of it is that the EQ is kind of like spice, right? And if you're having a good meal, if the food is inherently good, you can use a little bit of spice sparingly and it'll be delicious. You'll have a delicious meal. If the food isn't that great to begin with, you have to add all kinds of spice to it just to get it to taste really good. So when you go into a music store and you're going to try out a bass guitar, I suggest trying it out with everything set flat. So when you look at an amplifier and it has all these knobs on it with the EQ, and you might go to the music store and it might look like this, you know, put all those knobs in the middle. So we're not hearing all that spice and all that flavoring. We're hearing the instrument as flat as it can be, the instrument how it naturally sounds. Because if you like the fundamental sound of the instrument, then you'll be able to shape things how you like. Somebody is asking what wood a Rickenbacker is made from. It really depends which Rickenbacker we're talking about. I know they use, they've used different woods throughout the years. I know maple is a very common wood that they use, but there are also Rickenbacker models that have walnut on the sides of them. So hard to say exactly which one it is. Yeah, but it's changed quite a bit over the years with Rickenbacker basses. But yeah, I know maple is one of the very, very common ones that they use. So that's woods. We're going to wrap up this section on woods, and we're going to move on to electronics, specifically electronics in a bass guitar. We'll get into amplification later on down the road. So let's talk about electronics in a bass. These Fender basses, these original basses, were what we call passive instruments, which means they don't need any power. They don't need a battery to supply them with power. You just plug them in and they go. That's why they're called passive, because they don't need any kind of active circuit. And all the controls are passive, volume and tone control, right? If you see a bass with 3 or less knobs on it, it's most likely a passive bass. If you see a bass with more than 3 knobs on it, it's probably an active bass. And if we look over here at this F bass again, we see an active bass. So when we say active bass, that means it needs some kind of power in order to power this thing, which is called the preamp. Preamp, as in before the amp. We're given some tone shaping abilities right on the instrument before we go into the amp, where we can shape the tone more. So an active bass does require power, which comes via a single 9-volt battery, or sometimes 2 9-volt batteries, making an 18-volt circuit. Some people get worried, oh man, if I get this battery, is it going to be a pain in the butt? Am I going to have to change this all the time? No, you won't. I change my battery in my bass maybe once a year. That's about as often as you have to do it, as long as you don't leave the instrument plugged in when you're not using it. So if you have an active bass, when you're not using it, make sure the cable is unplugged. That will disengage the circuit and your battery will last much, much longer. If you leave the bass plugged in, you're going to drain your battery really fast. And how do you know if your battery is going dead? Your bass is going to sound distorted because it doesn't have enough power to power the preamp. So if you start to hear your bass sounding distorted, that's probably a sign that you need to change the battery on your active circuit if that's what you have. Typically, an active circuit will have a volume or 2. Sometimes it's a single volume and a pickup selector. Instead of 2 individual volumes, it'll be 1 volume and a blend between the 2 pickups. This F bass has a passive tone. So these 3 knobs here on this F bass are just like the 3 knobs on a jazz bass, right? Because we said George Fernaletto loves jazz basses, so he made this exactly like that. It's a volume, and a tone control. But then down here is where we added EQ, right? Which is what a lot of active basses have, bass, mid-range, and treble, so that you can shape your tone on the instrument itself, which can be really handy if you're playing on stage and you're up front near the front of the stage and you want a little bit more bottom end on your bass, but you don't want to run all the way back to your amp. You can just do it right there on the bass. But with EQ, especially active EQ, I recommend using it sparingly. Don't add a ton of it right off the bat. The bass should sound good as it is, and you can just add a little bit. One of the most common mistakes I see with people when they play an active bass is they crank everything up all the way till full, and sometimes that creates so much signal that the amp gets overloaded and starts to sound distorted. Or it could just be boomy. It might not be a very nice sounding bottom end. It might be too much overwhelming bottom end. That's a really common thing with people that are new to playing bass, is they dial in more bass than necessary. They're really trying to shake things, but it also kind of make things a little bit muffled. So start in the middle with your EQ and then work your way up and down as needed, making slight adjustments, but be careful not to just dial everything all the way to full. If it sounds great to you, but to me there are no hard and fast rules. If it sounds good, it sounds good, right? But just something to be aware of is using your EQ sparingly. I don't see any questions popping up on electronics, so the next topic is going to be strings. We'll talk about strings. So if you, there's mainly two kinds of strings that bass player use as far as the materials that are used for strings, and those would be nickel or stainless steel. Once again, talking about the tonal range, nickel is a warmer sounding string. Sounds really good for playing with your fingers, sounds good for slap bass techniques as well, but it's a warmer sounding string. It's a softer material, so it's not as hard on your frets, because these frets are made on metal and you have metal on metal contact when you play your instrument. So nickel is going to be softer on your frets. It's also going to be softer feeling on your hands, and it's going to have this warm sound. Whereas if you went with stainless steel strings, it's a very different experience. Stainless steel strings are more aggressive in every way. They're more aggressive on your frets, so they will carve up your frets a little bit more. So you'll get more denting in your frets from using stainless steel. They'll also carve up your hands a little bit more. They feel rougher on the hands. But what stainless steel gives you is a lot of growl and a lot of brightness. Geddy Lee used Rotosound stainless steel strings. Rotosound was really well known for their stainless steel strings. A lot of rock players like stainless steel because of the brightness and the grind that they get from them. A lot of slap players like stainless steel as well because of the brightness that they get from them. So those are the main two materials of the strings, is nickel or stainless steel. Someone is asking about flat versus round wound. The strings on all of these basses are round wounds. So what happens is there's a core in the middle of the bass, and then they wrap the string around the core. And they keep going and going and going and wrapping the string around. And that gives you a lot of sustain. A flat wound is the opposite. It's just a flat string. It doesn't have these windings on them. A flat wound string has much more attack. The attack is like, it's very thumpy, right? All acoustic basses are using flat wound strings, right? So take that kind of string, put it on electric bass, you get a lot of thump, but you don't get a lot of sustain. So you get this very quick, sharp attack, and then the decay goes down quite quickly. Whereas a round wound string will hit and it'll last longer. So once again, it depends on the tone that you want to achieve. If you want to have that James Jamerson sound, which was very warm, he had a warm sounding bass, and then he used flat wound strings, and he would keep his flat wound strings on as long as he could. He would intentionally get them extra dirty and greasy so they would sound more and more dull and muted so he could get a warmer sound. So to me, once again, there is no right choice. There's the right choice for you, for what you're trying to achieve. I prefer the sound of round wound strings 99% of the time. But if I wanted to play in like a R&B tribute band and we were doing all Motown stuff, I would get a 4-string P bass and a set of flat wounds and go for that kind of sound. Bo is asking what the point of the bridge cover is. On old Fender basses, there was a cover that would go over the bridge and a cover that would sometimes go over the pickups. Originally, those covers had a mute on the inside of them. So when the cover was on, that little piece of foam inside the cover would actually push down on the strings to mute the string even more. Once again, giving it less sustain and more attack, and it would be also a warmer sound. That's what happens when you would use those covers. But now, most of the time, if you see the covers on, they don't even have the foam anymore, and it's really just for decoration. Some people said it blocked electrostatic interference. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but mostly these days it's an aesthetic thing. It's just something that looks cool. But if you want, you can put the foam underneath it and have it mute your strings as well. Okay, so I think that answers the questions on strings. Okay, we're doing pretty good here. Please jump in with any other questions you have. We're moving on to amps next. So with amplifiers, I'm going to use this as an example. This is a Trainer bass amp, and if you're looking at us wondering why are they surrounded by Trainer bass amps, it's because the studio that we're working in is right next door to the Yorkville Trainer factory. So it's just sheer convenience. But of course, if you go into a Long McQuade store, we're going to have all kinds of different amplifiers for you to check out. Oh, somebody actually, this is a great question. Miroslav has asked, how do the different string size affect the sound? Thank you for asking that. That's a good one to cover as well. So the thickness of the string also changes the sound and the feel of the instrument, right? So a standard gauge for a 4-string bass would be 45 to 105. Those numbers represent the thickness of the string. The greater that number is, the thicker the string is. So you could get 50 to 110, which would be a thicker string. With more mass, you get a bigger sound. So more mass, bigger sound. So if you go for a thicker string, it's going to sound bigger. Bigger strings sound bigger. Thinner strings sound thinner. But bigger strings are also more difficult to play. You have to use a lot more strength to push the strings down and to move the strings themselves. Thinner strings are easier to play because they're nice and thin. You can, a bass player like Victor Wooten uses extremely light strings because he does a lot of kind of bass pyrotechnic virtuosic techniques that require using thinner strings like tapping and slapping, double thumping, that kind of stuff. But other bass players would prefer to use thicker strings to get that warmer, fatter sound and play more simply. So that's the difference of how different strings affect the sound. Thank you, Miroslav, for your question. So moving on now, we'll get back to amplifiers again. So I talked about Trainer. Pete Trainer was a genius inventor, a brilliant man who worked at the original Long McQuade store with Jack Long. He has passed away, so rest in peace, Pete Trainer, and thank you for these incredible inventions. Pete was one of the first people to create PA systems and to create bass amplifiers. Up until then, it was upright bass players just playing acoustically in big bands. And as you can imagine, an upright bass can only project so much sound, and they would often get drowned out in these big bands. So Pete started designing bass amplifiers so the bass player could be heard more often, and they were selling them at Jack's original Long McQuade store. But they were expensive because there wasn't a lot of them back then, so people would come in and ask if they could rent one of these bass amps for their band, or as they called it back then, buying it on time, which we now call financing. And Jack wanted to help out his music community, and that was the beginning of our rental and our financing program. He knew all the musicians in the scene, so he would let them take the gear, and our rental program began, and bass players became amplified, and everyone could hear the bass player much better than they had before, sometimes to their detriment, because a lot of bass players were playing out of tune, but nobody could really hear them until they had the amplifier, and then they quickly realized, wow, that guy's really out of tune. So it kind of propelled bass playing in that way because bass players could be heard better. And the original bass amps back then would have been tube amps, which is what this YBA series trainer amplifier is here. It's all powered by tubes, which sounds great. Tubes give an amplifier a very warm, very thick sound. People know the old Trainer tube amps. Actually, we have a piece of history right here. Here's a Trainer Bassmates tube amplifier, little piece of history there for you. Tube amps sound incredible. There's no doubt about it. They sound warm, they sound thick, they sound full. The problem with tube amps is that they're very heavy. It's an extremely heavy amp to carry, and they also require quite a bit of servicing because you have to change the tubes. The tubes can be costly, and so to change your tubes every year or two can be a pretty expensive operation. But there's nothing quite like the sound of a tube amp. But once solid state amps were invented for bass guitar, people kind of quickly turned away from the tube amp. They're still used, but not nearly as common. If you go into a music store, most of what you're going to see is a solid state bass amp, because bass is very different than guitar, right? Because bass is a low frequency, it requires a lot more power to push a bass amp than it does to push a guitar amp. You know, think of it as if you're actually pushing something. Guitar is a frequency range that's more in the mid-range, and those frequencies, mid-range and treble frequencies, need less power to push them because they're smaller, lighter frequencies, whereas a big, heavy frequency like the bass needs a lot more power to push it. Somebody asks, how bad is it to run a bass through a guitar amp? It can be bad. At the very least, it will just not sound good. At the very worst, you could possibly blow up your guitar amp by doing it because, as we're discussing now, bass is a very big frequency and it requires a lot of power to push it. So if you try to push a bass through a guitar amp, it's not designed to do that. It's not designed to fit in that frequency range. So your bass will sound really narrow. And you could possibly blow up your guitar amp. So it's best to use a bass through a bass amp. Someone else, Glendale, is asking, for using an amp, do we set it flat and set EQ on the bass, or set bass EQ flat and shape EQ on the amp? Great question, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. Before I get into the EQing, I want to talk about the three parts of an amp, because we call something like this an amp, but this is actually three things. It's a preamp, which is this part here. The preamp is where all your tone shaping is. Bass, treble, mid-range, gain, that's the preamp, the tone shaping part of the amp. And in the back, you have the power amp, which is where we actually get our amplitude from, where we get our power from. That's the second part. To power the third part, which is the speaker, right? So when we say amp, we're actually referring to three things: a preamp, a power amp, and a speaker. Actually, the technically correct thing to call this is a combo amp, because it's a combination of all three things. So this is a bass combo amp. This is a small block 110. It's a great small little amplifier to get you going. These amps, I think, cost around $500, and then there is the single 15 version here as well. And these are around $600 for the 15. This is a 200 watt amp, so I want to talk about how much power, and then we'll get back to the EQ, how much power you will need to play your bass. If you're starting off and you're just playing in your bedroom, you don't need a lot of power. Most people use something around 15 watts. And the most popular bass amps for just practicing in your bedroom would be a Fender Rumble amp or Ampeg BA series amplifier. Those are great amps to begin with, great combo amps to start off with. They're around $140, so they're not expensive. They'll sound great playing in your bedroom. But 15 watts would not be enough power if you're going to go out and play in a band. If you're going to play with a drummer, I recommend getting a bass amplifier that's at least 200 watts, depending on how loud your drummers are. Not every drummer is quiet or loud. They change. So depending on the volume your drummer likes to play at, if you're playing in a metal band or you're playing in an R&B band, that will affect how powerful of an amp you will need. So it might be surprising, especially if you're a guitar player and you're used to knowing that with a 50-watt amplifier, it can be crushing. A 50-watt guitar amplifier can be devastatingly loud. But for a bass player to keep up with a 50-watt guitar amp, he will probably, or he or she will probably need a 200-watt bass amp in order to do that. So that's what I would recommend as a minimum if you're going to be playing with a band, is around 200 watts. Now, as far as setting your EQ, Glendale asked, should I set it on the bass, should I set it on the amp? I would recommend starting everything flat. The EQ right in the middle on the bass guitar. Normally there's a little dent where the middle is for the EQ, starting with the EQ flat on there, and same with the controls on the amp. Normally there's a little dent in the middle. Just start with everything flat, and then you have to experiment with yourself with where you like the sound to come from, because each one of these equalization points is set at a different point. Each one of these parameters is set at a different point of EQ. So your bass might be set on a different frequency on your amp than it is on your bass guitar. So I say experiment. Start with everything flat. Normally, I'll make the adjustments on the amp first if there's something I hear. So if I get in a room, I plug in my gear, I start playing, and I hear, ooh, the low mids are a little too boomy, normally I'm going to dial that back on my amp first. And I'll save the EQ on my bass for things that I want to do live and in the moment. As we were talking about earlier, when you solo the bridge pickup, so when you turn the neck pickup lower and you have the bridge pickup higher, it thins out the sound. You get this aggressiveness, but it kind of thins out the sound. And one way you can come to a compromise with that is if you have an active bass and you're soloed on the bridge pickup, you can turn up the bass on your active bass. So now you have a little bit more bottom end when you're using your bridge pickup. So you can still have the thickness, but you can have that punch as well. So that's one way you can get around that. So that's combo amps. What comes after a combo amp is splitting up those parts and going with a head and a cabinet, which is what you see in something like this. We have the YBA 300 tube head here, and we have a Trainer TC410 cabinet here. What the advantage is of going to a head and cabinet is that you can kind of mix and match. For a lot of professional bass players, they might use different things depending on the situation. So maybe in one gigging situation, they just need a small cabinet, maybe a single 12 with a head. But then if they're playing a bigger gig, they want to bring a 212 or a 410 and a head. So you can just have one head and have a couple of different sizes of cabinets to vary it. Or you can start combining different series of speakers. Trainer makes a cabinet with two 10s and a 15, so you get the punch of the 10s, but you get the warmth of the 15, which is a really balanced sounding cabinet. And then you can also mix and match manufacturers when you're using a head and a cabinet. Maybe you like the sound of a Mark bass head, but you like the sound of an SWR cabinet. You can kind of mix and match them to actually, is SWR even around anymore? You can kind of mix and match them to your liking. So you have a lot of different flavors there to choose from by mixing and matching your head and cabinet. Generally, heads and cabs are going to be more powerful than combo amps. There are quite powerful combo amps out there, but a lot of times when you're going for a head, it's going to have more wattage than would be available in a combo amp. So originally, as I was saying, bass amps were all tube amps, very big, very heavy, very warm sounding though, killer sound. But then solid state amps came out, and the solid state amps have continued to evolve and evolve and evolve and become lighter and lighter and lighter. Bass players have, as far as their amplification goes, have become less like guitar players. Guitar players still love a tube amp because there's such a sound. Bass players, the technology used in bass amps are closer to PA systems than they are to guitar amps now, because bass requires so much power to push it. It's a completely different thing. So Trainer came out with this head, which I use, which is Killer, which is the small block 500. It's so light. You can throw this head in the front of your gig bag and will barely even feel it. It's unbelievably light, has great tone shaping abilities on it. So that's the advantage with the solid state amps, is that they're a lot lighter. Maybe they don't sound as big or as warm as the tube amps, but you get the convenience of a lighter amp. And that's the funny thing when it comes to equipment, is with every gain, normally there's a loss. You gain something, but you lose something. Once again, I never see things as this is necessarily better than that. It's what do you want to achieve? If you want a tube amp sound and don't mind carrying it, then that's what you want. But I know a lot of bass players are like, I'm sick of carrying around heavy gear. I'll sacrifice a little bit of that warmth for something that's much lighter. And I'm in that category. I would rather have something a little bit lighter. So some of the controls that we'll look at: bass, low mid, high mid, treble, low expander, master, and over here gain. So I'll go through each one of these. First of all, when you plug into a bass amp, the first thing you want to do, even before you turn your volume up, start with the volume off. You want to set your gain level. This is another common mistake, is people don't set their gain level right, and they have too much gain or too little gain for what they're trying to do. So you should see a clip light. I can't really see it that well from the angle I'm sitting at. So if I start digging into my bass and turning up the gain, hopefully I'll be able to make it clip. I might not be able to make it clip with this bass because this is a passive bass. But normally you play until that red light goes on. And if you're digging in really hard, or if you're playing an active bass, you might see this has a lot of headroom. That's what we call it, is headroom. So it's actually hard to make this preamp clip, which is a pretty good thing. There's a lot of headroom there. But play until you see that red light come on, and then start dialing your gain back until you don't see it come on that often. Maybe once in a while you might see it flash. This is controlling how much signal is getting into the amp. And you want as much signal getting into the amp as possible. I play my bass generally with the volume all the way up full, and the gain as high as I can get it, so I'm getting the maximum amount of signal in here. Because if your bass is turned down, if your gain is set too low, you won't get as much volume out of your amp. Or if your gain is set too high and it's clipping, you're going to get distortion. So play as hard as you can, volume off, till you get that red light going up, then dial it back until the red light dims down and is only going on occasionally, if at all. So then your gain setting is set, then you can turn up your volume. So you've got your volume up. Oh, maybe that, I wonder if that will change anything if we, no, won't change anything. So then you can get your volume set where you like. Once again, before you start shaping your tone with your EQ, get your volume where you like, and then you can start shaping things from there. If you want to add more bass, to me that already is starting to sound a little too muffled by adding that. I actually like it better right in the middle, where I can still hear the note, the tonality of the note. You can turn your low mids down, turn your low mids up, right? It's getting barkier sounding now. Same with the high mids, you'll get more growl by turning those up or dulling it down. Now we're kind of scooping the mid-range out a little bit. And of course, treble is going to give us some extra brightness, right? Some people find that too harsh. Some people, like Fieldy from Korn, uses a ton of treble on his bass. Depends on what kind of sound you're going for. And then a lot of bass amps will have something like this, the low expander. And most of the time what this control does is it'll scoop out that mid-range. So if we're looking at the EQ like this, as we turn that knob, it'll scoop out the mid-range more and more. Now it sounds a little deeper. Now it sounds really deep. Now when it's all the way over, you can hear just the lowest frequencies and just the highest frequencies and not a lot in the middle. Some people really like this sound. Fieldy from Korn being one of the people that really likes that kind of sound. Having it here, we get a little bit more bark from the mid-range. So you just have to use that flavoring as you see fit, and it's going to depend on the musicians. that you're playing with as well, and the style of music. The other thing that you'll run into as a bass player is guitar players that use a lot of bass on their sound, especially when someone is a novice musician. If a guitar player has been playing by themselves, they're trying to fill up a lot of space with their guitar sound, and they'll typically use a lot of bass and not understand that once a bass player is in the room, they can actually turn the bass down because there's a bass player to take that job for them. Their sound will be better, and you'll be able to pop through the mix. But asking your guitar player to turn their bass down is a whole other topic, which someone else will cover sometime. Let's see some questions here. Anusan is asking, how do you choose the right cabinet for your head? You have to try a bunch of them. When people come into our store, that's what we like to do, is if they have a head that they like, we set them up with a few different cabinets to hear the tonality. And it's also going to depend on the kind of playing that you're doing, whether you need something big, something small. But I say try a variety. For many years, 210 cabinet and a single 15 cabinet were the most popular cabinets. People either use a 210 or a 15. Sometimes they would combine them both, or they would use a 410 or maybe two 15s. But then somewhere probably around, I don't know, mid-2000s, 12s became really popular, mid to late 2000s, and now 12s are one of the most popular sizes of bass cabinets because it's right in the middle of a 10 and a 15. A 10-inch speaker is going to give you more punch, more bite, more mid-range. A 15-inch because it's a smaller speaker, whereas a 15-inch speaker is going to be a rounder, warmer sound. So you combine 10s and 15s, you can kind of meet in the middle. But a 12 is a compromise right in between the two. You get the closer to the depth of the 15 and closer to the punch of the 10, all in one cabinet. And speakers have become so efficient now that you can buy a single 12-inch speaker that sounds incredible, or even a 212 that sounds incredible. So Anusan, I suggest you go plug your head into a few different cabs and see what the sound is that you like. And Mark is asking thoughts on a mixer and PA speakers versus a proper bass amp setup. You got to do what sounds good for you. Either can work. I would not be offended by seeing a bass player who plays through a PA system. PA systems are full range. I've sometimes had my amp break down on stage and gone through a monitor, and if it's a great PA system, a monitor can sound great. And bass, if you're playing live, it's inevitably going to go through a PA system anyways. So if you are getting a great sound through a mixer and a PA speaker, then there's no need to change, unless there is a bass amp that offers you something better, But bass amps are going to be geared more towards bass guitar, of course, but there's no reason why a PA system can't work. So that's that question. We got another question here. We're just trying to get it the right size so that it's readable. How do you mic your bass when you record? Do you double the line in with a mic on the amp, right? So today what you're listening to is direct. So another feature on most bass amps is a direct out, which is on the back of the amp. Or I can show you on this. It has this line out here, this XLR out. That's your direct line out. The overwhelming majority of the time live, people are just going to be going from this into the PA system to amplify their sound through the PA system. But when people record, they will sometimes, and this is what the question is do you record direct or do you mic up the amp? You have to do what works for you. There's going to be pros and cons to each. I like recording direct because it's very simple, just to plug straight in, and generally you can get a pretty good clear sound from going direct as long as you have a good direct box. But when you mic the speaker up properly, you can get a warmth and a liveness to the sound that sometimes you can't get with the direct box. The direct box can sound a little bit more sterile sometimes. So some people like to do this combination of mic on the speaker and direct signal from the bass, and you can combine that, but you just have to be careful because sometimes they can interfere with one another. So you have to set them in a way so that they're not interfering with one another, that you're not getting comb filtering and kind of getting some cancellation. But yeah, I suggest you try a few different things recording. There's so many different techniques you can try in recording and tracking a bass. You know, that could be a whole other topic, is recording your bass. But if you want the quick and fast, easy approach, go direct in. And then you can use plugins if you want to. There's a lot of great amp simulator plugins. Amp simulator and amp modeling has come a long way. Even people that used to hate it and used to think it was absolutely terrible and could never compare to a real amp, it's come so far, and the amp models are really good. I use the plugin by Universal Audio. They make an Ampeg SVT, so it's an emulation of a tube amp. I think it sounds fantastic, sounds outstanding. So that's another great way to do it. Or try miking up your amp. You know, if you really know what you're doing when it comes to miking an amp and using direct line, that can be some of the best recorded bass tone you can get. But yeah, you have to do some experimenting or have a lot of experience to get it to work for you really well. Otherwise, it's just easier to go with one or another. Hopefully that answers your question. Sean Pierce is asking, what is the minus 15 decibel button primarily used for on my Ampeg amp? Thank you for asking that question, Sean, because that's something that I hadn't pointed out yet. Maybe we'll switch to, I don't know which camera picks this up better, but if we look back at the input on this, there's a passive input and an active input. And if we look at on this amp, on the passive input it says 0 dB, and on the active input it says minus 6 decibels. On Sean's amp, it says minus 15. It's a button. Instead of having two inputs, it's a button. So what that's for, calling it passive and active is an oversimplification. What they're actually trying to protect themselves from is someone who picks up an active bass. If they know it's active, they're going to plug into the active, which is going to take down the decibel. Minus 15 means minus 15 decibels. So it's shaving 15 decibels of the signal of your bass off before it goes into the rest of this. Now, why would you want to do that? If you had a really hot bass signal that was distorting the amp. So remember I was talking about setting the gain properly? If you hadn't set your gain properly and you had all your EQ cranked up all the way, then you could get distortion. But if you were plugged into the active input, then you could shave off some of those decibels so that it wasn't clipping the preamp. So it's very rare that I ever press that 15 button or use the active input, because to me, as if you're using the bass EQ sparingly, you probably won't need it. But if you're really cranking an active EQ all the way, or if you're using pedals, like sometimes you might use a compressor pedal that's really boosting your signal, and it's making it so hot that like even with the gain down, it's clipping, then you could press your minus 15 decibel button or plug into the active section of your amplifier. So I hope that answers your question. Where does a DI box come into play with a bass? So we showed the line out just now. Most bass amplifiers have a line out built into them. Once upon a time, it wasn't a common feature, so people would use a direct box instead of, because they didn't have a line out. So you would show up to a gig and there would be a direct box sitting on stage for you and plug into it. Most of the time, sound men don't even put a DI box on the stage anymore, because almost every bass amp comes with a DI built into it or a line out. So they just leave a cable there for you to plug into. But every line out is built differently. There's a conversion that's happening there in the impedance between the high impedance of the amp and the low impedance that it's switching to go into the amplifier, the PA system. So to not overly complicate that process of conversion, the higher quality the box is that's doing that conversion, the better sound you're going to get. So I mean, there are DI boxes out there that cost $1,000, and that's all they're doing is taking the instrument level to line level, but they're doing that conversion with the highest quality components so that it's the best sound in the amp. So one of those external DI boxes that costs $1,000 might sound a lot better than the line out that's in your $500 or $600 amplifier, right? So that's why you might want to use a DI box. So if you were going to record, you could try it both ways. Listen to the line out of your amp, then listen through it through the DI box at the recording studio and see which one sounds better. See what you like the sound of better. Do you carry many Class D PA amplifiers? I need a lightweight solution with my Alembic F2B. Yeah, definitely call one of your local Long McQuade stores. There are a lot of lightweight D-class amplifiers out there for PA that can definitely be acquired. Yeah, you're using, this fellow Larry that's asking the question is using an Alembic outboard preamp. So remember how I said a combo amp is actually three things? Larry has those three things separated. So it's so in a combo amp, you've got all three built together, and a head and a cabinet. The head has the preamp and the power amp, and then you just need a cabinet. But in Larry's situation, he has just a preamp, he has a speaker, and he's looking for a power amp. So yeah, there should be some options. It's probably something that a lot of stores might need to order because we don't stock a ton of Class D power amps depending on the store, but call your local Long McQuade and they should be able to get you set up with something. Marty is saying, to me it doesn't sound like bass that is directly input to the stream, but more from the speaker in the room. Interesting.
Because your mic is picking up the sound in the room, so maybe give them a little playing sample. I'll cut your mic so they can hear how just the DI sounds. Okay, cool. Yeah, good idea. Thanks for the comment, Marty. Yeah, and Matt makes a good point. Because we're in a room and I'm mic'd, we're hearing that. So what should we do here first? Let's listen to it with the mic on and then with the mic off. Sure. Okay, so let's play Queen again. Shut the mic off. There we go. So that's it both ways. I don't know, Marty, if that sounded different to you one way or the other, but that's the difference between it picking up my mic in the room and without my mic in the room. So we're going to be wrapping up amplifiers here. So if you have any last questions on amplifiers, please fire them off now. We're going to be going into effects next, but I hope that was helpful for you. Combo amp, head versus cab, how to set your EQ, and most importantly, get that gain level set right. Volume down, get the clip light activated, and then turn it down until it's not clipping, so you're getting the maximum input into the amp before you're starting to turn up your volume or shape your EQ. Marty is asking, with a DI box, are you hearing the amp qualities? Yes, most of the time. Some of them have a switch. On some line outs, it says pre or post. If you select pre, the signal you're sending to the PA system is the sound of your bass before it goes through your preamp. So before you've shaped the tone with the preamp, it's just the sound of your bass going to it. If you select post, if you push that button in and select post, you're getting the sound of the amplifier as well. So with the DI box, yes, you can or cannot get the sound of the preamp itself. You won't be getting the sound of the speaker. Thank you for your question, Marty. Hopefully that answers the question. Okay, I think that's that. So next we're going to talk about effects. I love bass effects. I'm addicted to bass effects. I have a lot of bass effects because I've been working at Long McQuade for 20 years. So I've had a lot of opportunity to stock up on bass effects. And I just love sound, and I love shaping sound. And I love what effects can do for shaping sound. Now, of course, because you're a bass player, people want you to keep things simple. So you have to be careful with how you're using your effects if you want to please other people. If you don't want to please other people, go crazy with your effects, do what you want, and maybe you're going to come up with some kind of incredible sound. But effects to me are a great way to shape your sound, to add another dimension to your sound, and sometimes to make your instrument sound like a different instrument, in most of the cases synthesizer. So we'll be talking about these effects. So I've got a pedal board set up here with a variety of effects. We'll go through each one of these. Now, I don't think all of these are necessary for a bass player. In fact, none of them are necessary. You could play bass perfectly well without ever plugging into an effect pedal. But if you are going to, it's going to be for a specific purpose. So we'll go through these one at a time. I'm going to start over here with the SansAmp bass driver DI. What the SansAmp bass driver does is it attempts to give you the sound of a tube amp from a pedal. So if you don't want to lug around a tube amp, you could use a SansAmp bass driver to get the sound of a tube amp. Most of the time, people use this to get more gain, to get more distortion, to get kind of a grindier sound. To me, this is a must-have for any bass player that's playing rock. If you're going to play hard rock or metal, a SansAmp, I always have it in the chain and it's on the entire time. So I'll let you hear what it sounds like first, and then I'll talk about it. So if we just take the normal sound of the bass, now let's turn on, oops, actually let me do that one more time so we're in balance. Without it on, just the natural sound of the bass. Now let's kick on the SansAmp. So you can see, especially the way I have it set up right now, there's a lot of grind, there's a lot of teeth, there's a lot of grit to it, and that is an overdriven bass sound, which can be a great sound. Sometimes it doesn't sound as good on its own as it does once it gets into the mix. One thing that was very revealing to me is sometimes I would hear a bass, I would be in a studio and hear a bass in a mix and think, man, that bass sounds great, and I would ask the engineer to solo the bass so I can hear just what the bass sounds like. And in the mix it would sound totally clean, but then he would solo it and it would sound like this. It would sound all clanky and dirty, because if you're competing, say, with distorted guitars, you're going to need that little bit of grit and teeth to help you cut through. So that's what I love about the SansAmp. And to me, this sound is made famous by the band Tool and the bass player Justin Chancellor, who has one of these on pretty much all the time. It's a great sound. If we think of Tool, or Sober, so if I shut that off and play the same bass line, it doesn't have the same impact. Turn it back on. All of a sudden we have this depth to the sound. So let's look at some of the controls on this. So you have your level, which is what you're going to use to get the sound level. So if I listen to my clean sound, and then I turn this on, I could have this boosted so that this is louder than my clean, but typically I want it pretty balanced, maybe just a little bit extra. And then what I love about the SansAmp is this knob right here, the blend knob. This blends between the sound of this and the natural sound of my bass. So if I go all the way to the left, it's just my normal bass sound. Then as I start to blend in, I get more of the sound of my SansAmp. So that's a really nice feature to have, because something that happens with distortion is sometimes when you start applying overdrive to your bass, you get less bottom end. But when you have a blend knob like that, you can blend in the natural sound of your bass and give yourself a fuller sound. So you still have the natural bass plus the sound of the pedal. Then you've got treble, which is going to add brightness, presence, which is a little bit brighter than treble, which is going to add more brightness, and then drive, which is kind of the amount of overdrive, the amount of grit and distortion. If I turn it up, we can hear that we can blow things up pretty good, pretty quickly, so I won't turn it up too much because I probably just distorted your speakers. And if we haven't said it yet, I should say it now. If you're listening to this, because it's a bass guitar, I suggest you listen with headphones on. Headphones or through a good set of speakers. Listening through your phone will not give you the entire picture because a phone speaker is just too small to properly represent a bass guitar. And then finally, mid-range and bass. So you can see I've scooped out the mids. I've turned the bass down a little bit because the bass on the Sans amp is really, really powerful, but I still have this very deep sound. So Sans amp bass driver is also a DI. There's an XLR out right there, which is a really handy feature to have. Because now, if you want the easiest way to get a great recorded bass sound, especially for rock, is just to take a Sans amp, plug your bass in, and go direct into the board. It sounds incredible. Any bass will, Ernie Ball Stingrays sound great through these as well. And that's the Sans amp bass driver. I think every rock bass player should have one of these. And there are also ones you can get where they have multiple scenes that you can set up. So you could set up a few different types of tones for yourself. So you can have three different, you can have like a slap sound and a distorted sound and an overdriven sound. So you can check out the Sans amp Tech 21s. Let's see, Mitch is asking, what makes a good distortion on bass? Most sound too noisy. Yeah, it can get pretty noisy sounding on bass for sure. So you have to try to find the one that you like, especially when it comes to distortion. Overdrive, really easy. The Tech 21 Sans amp does it for me every time. But when you're talking about distortion, we're talking about a higher level than just overdrive. We're talking about something really so overdriven that it's distortion, almost like a fuzz pedal. And there are some good solutions out there. MXR makes a great phase fuzz pedal, which is one I would suggest you check out. But you have to try them out just to find the one that sounds right for you. But a lot of them do create noise for sure. And sometimes you just might have to put a noise gate pedal after it to reduce the amount of noise that you're getting. That's one of the best ways to do it, is with a noise gate pedal set. When you're not playing, there's not all this extra sound, and you can set the gate how you like. So if you have a distortion that you love the sound of, but it's just too noisy, try a noise gate. If you don't like the sound of the distortion pedal, try some different ones out. There are some great ones out there. Okay, the next question is, I'm never happy with my slap tone. Would the Sans amp cure that? What EQ do you set for slap? So slap tone typically has the mid-range scooped out, right? So if I was going to set up a slap tone on this Sans amp, I would turn the drive way down because we don't need all that distortion. Probably turn the blend over a little bit. Keep the mid-range scooped. So let's hear how that sounds. 2. This sounds more bass. Blend it over a little bit more. So let's play a bass line and I'll click it on and off. So a Sans amp could potentially solve your problem. The other thing that could solve your problem is just the way you shape your EQ. And once again, it's by scooping out the mid-range. So you could do that by just turning down your low mid and your high mid on your amp, right? And because you've cut some EQ, you'll need to increase your volume. Right? Or the other way you could do it is if you have one of these low expanders on your amp. They're called different things on different amps. If I turn this up all the way, kind of sounds the same. Same as turning these down. I'm scooping out that mid-range, which is going to bring up the bass and treble. As opposed to what sounds honkier, right? A little bit too much mid-range. So that's your best solution for getting a great sound, is scooping out the mid-range a little bit for yourself. So give that a try. I hope that works well for you. Someone's asking about compressor on slap. Compression is a beautiful thing. I enjoy compression, but it's tricky to use. It's tricky to get right. It's really easy to overdo it. And it's very different recording versus live. When I record, I love using a nice compressor on my bass. And once again, with a compressor, what I look for is a blend knob. Just like on this, it's really nice when you can blend in some uncompressed sound with the compressed sound. And MXR makes this brilliant little compressor pedal. It's tiny. It's a micro pedal. I've got it on my main pedal board. It's fantastic. It's got a blend knob on it. And yeah, you can use a compressor on slap. It will help even things out, definitely, but it's not necessary. You don't have to have it. I've heard lots of great bass players that have used no compression and have an excellent slap sound. So try it out. Definitely try out that MXR one with the blend control. But compressors take a while to learn how to use. They're not the most user-friendly thing, especially for bass. It's easy to lose bottom end and to lose dynamics, and especially when you want to dig in. If you've got a compressor, you might not be able to dig in and get the kind of dynamic range you're used to, so they can be tricky. But try a few out and see what works for you. Moving on next, we'll talk about the bass synthesizer. This is a Boss bass synthesizer that we're trying out today. But there's lots of bass synthesizers out there, ranging from inexpensive to very expensive. The Boss one is a really well-known one. And this is to do just that, to emulate the sound of a synthesizer, which you'll often have to do as a bass player, especially if you're playing cover gigs. There'll be synth parts that need to be covered. So here's my bass sound. Now let's kick on the bass synthesizer. Sounds pretty cool, right? So there, on the Boss bass synth, there's a bunch of different controls here. So starting from here, we have the mode, which is giving us the kind of bass synthesizer sound. So I have it on number 2, but I'll just quickly take you through each one. Here's number 1. Here's number 2. This is what I was using, which kind of gives us a bit of an extra low frequency on top of it. Number 3, these are, now I'm not even doing anything. I just hit a note and the pedal is doing things for me. So there's 7 different modes that you can choose from. Every single one of them with their own sound. So I won't go through every single one, but you can play with it and see which sound you like. And then you can kind of shape your sound as you like. So I'll go back to number 2. And now this has, once again, one of my favorite features is a blend control. In this, instead of being a blend, it's an effect in the middle and your direct sound on the bottom. So if I turn the direct sound off, now I'm just hearing the sound of the pedal. Turn it up. Now I'm blending in my bass sound with that. And then this controls the amount of effect. Just my clean bass sound, I start to turn it up, and I blend in that. Then the next dial we have frequency. So see how it sounds less bright now and darker as I turn this up. We can hear more of those upper harmonics, right? And then the resonance, which is kind of the peak of the sound. Right? You start turning up the resonance and the frequency. Just by turning the knob, we can get cool sounds. Which is how a synthesizer works as well. And then your decay rate, which is how quickly that sound disappears. So that's very quick and very long. So that's a bass synth in a nutshell. Cool thing to have on your pedal board. Definitely not necessary. Might have upset some people, might upset your guitar player, but something cool that can be added if you like. For me, another must-have effect besides the Sans amp for bass players is an octaver pedal. So what an octaver pedal does is it gives you, most often it's a note below the note you're playing. So you get a richer, fuller sound in the bottom end. So if I play my ordinary bass sound, step on the octave, so now there's a note underneath this note. You can hear a lower note. The trick is, because it's adding a lower note than what you're playing, you have to play higher up on your bass or else it'll sound terrible, right? Normally they track about down to a G. So if I have this on and I play a G, it works. If I go to an F sharp, see, it starts freaking out. Go up to the G, holding together. A holds together really nice. But generally, you can't go a B string, will just be mud. So you're going to have to play above the G. Really fattens up your sound. So if you come to a part of your song and you really want to punch it, you want to bring in that sub bass, that's the way to do it. So on this pedal, once again, we have our direct level, which I love. That's just the natural sound of the bass. Dial in as much as that. We have octave 1, which is 1 octave below the note you're playing. And then we have octave 2. That's where you got to be careful, because that's 2 octaves below the note you're playing. So if you're going to use octave 2, you have to play much higher up your bass, or you're going to have those tracking problems. So let's turn up octave 2 and let's play way up here. But right now, I'm getting closer. Doesn't work so well when I get down there. Same thing. Now I have to play the G here and above, instead of the G down here, the G here and above, to get it to track really well. And then a trick, if you ever knew who Will Lee was, he was the bass player on the David Letterman band. One of the tricks that he used to do with his octave pedal to get it to sound kind of like a synth, kind of like the sine wave on a synth, is he would turn the direct level totally off, and then he would turn both octaves up and play high up on his bass. Totally different kind of sound. Sounds more like a synthesizer. And it's shaking this entire room. So it's a very powerful thing to do. So be careful with how you use your octave pedal, because once again, with effects, it can add a lot of depth, but can also create a lot of problems if you're not using them well. But octave pedal is a great pedal for every bass player to have. Let's get funky now with the bass envelope filter. I just recently got this pedal. I bought this MXR bass envelope filter and I absolutely adore it. I haven't found a lot of envelope filters that I've liked the sound of, but I found this and it is fantastic. So the envelope filter gives us this kind of underwater funky sound. So here's a bass line. Without it. With it. the sound from Bootsy Collins or from Flea or more currently Thundercat. The bass player Thundercat nearly probably 75% of the time has an envelope filter on. Very cool sound. I love this envelope filter. Once again, it has my favorite feature, which is a blend. I can dial in the amount of bass. If I had this all the way, this dry knob is the amount of bass I have. So if I turn that off, this is the amount of the effect. So this is just the effect. As you can see, an envelope filter without the bass dialed in, without the natural sound of your bass, it's a little thin. If I add that dry signal, sounds a lot more thick, and you can add as much or as little as you like. So once you get those in the right place, then it's just a matter of dialing in these three knobs to get it where you like. The sensitivity is going to control how easy it is to get that envelope to trigger. So if it's turned down, I can't get it to trigger. Keep turning it up, and now I've got it. And then the Q is going to change how wide the Q is that's being affected, the range of the EQ that's being affected, where its placement is. So that's a lot of low mids. So that's basically the deal with the envelope filter pedal. Highly recommend this MXR one. I think it sounds fantastic. Love the control that we've got over it. And that's a way to get yourself really funky. I'm going to skip the flanger for a moment. We'll come back to the flanger and we'll move on to the chorus pedal. Chorus pedal is one that's also often used by bass players. Jocko used the chorus pedal incessantly. Anthony Jackson also often used a chorus pedal. It adds a little bit of depth and dimension to the sound. I love this chorus pedal, which is the CE2 by Boss. This is the Wazacraft version, so it's a retake on the old Japanese Boss pedals that were manufactured. So let's kick on the chorus pedal and see what this does for us. I'll play a bass line without it, and then I'll kick it on. Very cool sound. I like getting that Jocko sound sometimes by soloing the bridge pickup and then turning on the chorus pedal. But it's a very distinct sound. To me, the chorus pedal sounds like the 80s. Whenever I hear a chorus pedal come on, I think of the 80s because it was a popular sound in the 80s. So that's what a chorus pedal can do for you. And then, and as far as the functions on this, we have a rate, which is how fast that chorus is going to be waving. See if I turn it up there. Right? It's moving really fast. And the depth, which is how deep that is. So not a lot of depth, a lot more. I like my sweet spot around here where it's just a little bit of wavering and a lot of depth. And that's chorus pedal for you. And last, we'll talk about the flanger. I don't think there's a lot of bass players that use flangers unless they're really into effects. But the bass player I love that uses a flanger is Justin Chancellor from Tool. The same guy that loves the SansAmp DI also loves this flanger, and you'll instantly recognize it. I'll play that bass line from 46 in 2 again. I'll play it first without the flanger, with the SansAmp on. Turn the flanger on. So you can instantly hear that kind of Tool-ish sound.
Can you do it one more time, more wet?
More wet?
Just to hear it a little bit.
Yeah. Actually, this does not have a wet control on it.
More effect? Nothing?
No,
Okay.
we can't. That's as manual. Yeah, I think that's as much as we're gonna get. Oh, well, let's try it on ultra mode. We'll probably get a little bit more. It's really modulating the sound. You can hear it modulating the sound and kind of making this wave with the sound, and different frequencies are coming up and going down. Yeah, that was a little bit of a more extreme example. You could also add a chorus pedal on top of that. Pretty cool sound. I love the sound of a flanger to kick on, to give the bass some movement, especially when you have it combined with an overdrive. You can get a lot of sustain and create kind of a big sheet of sound. So those are my favorite bass effects: synthesizers, octavers, envelope filters, overdrive, chorus, and flanger. But try anything on your bass, get creative. That's what I love doing with effects, is just getting really creative with them.
Hey Dan, I have a question.
Yeah.
Are these pedals, the chorus, flanger, and octave, are they built for bass, or are you using guitar pedals?
Yeah, that's a great question. Those ones are not specifically for bass. You can see that 3 of these pedals are specific to bass: the overdrive, the bass synth, and the envelope filter. But the octave, flanger, and chorus are not specific to bass. They do make a bass flanger. You can get a bass flanger. There are bass choruses as well. But I just say, just because it doesn't say bass on it doesn't mean you can't use it on bass. So try it out and see what it sounds like by mixing different effect pedals. There are guitar overdrive pedals that sound amazing on bass. One of my favorite distortion pedals of all time. I wish this was something they would remake so we could sell them to all of you at our store, but it's the HM2 by Boss, the heavy metal pedal. The Boss heavy metal pedal. It's a Japanese pedal. I shouldn't be talking about it because they'll all disappear, but that is one of my favorite bass distortion pedals, and it's not designed for bass at all. It's designed for guitar, and I've never heard a fuzz pedal that sounds as great as that thing. So that's another one you can check out and look for. But yeah, it doesn't have to be a bass pedal. Try them out, but generally if it's designed for bass, it's going to retain more of the bottom end. But sometimes, in the example of a chorus, it removes a little bit of bottom end, but I like some of the bottom end that it removes. It kind of punches the sound forward a little bit more. Richie is asking, is that chorus Waza better than the CEB for bass? When it comes to better, once again, it's all a matter of personal taste to me. I like the sound of the CE2 better for me. It does what I like better, but try them both out side by side and see what's better for you. In the end, it's all what's better for you. Sound is a completely subjective thing. There's really no way to measure it. It's personal taste. Maybe you like more spice. Maybe you don't like more spice. It comes down to personal taste. But Richie, I say try them both out and see what you like the sound of better. Dial them in with similar settings and see what works better for you. The bass one might retain more bottom end than the CE2 does. All right, well that wraps up effects. If there are any other questions, please ask. Matt is asking about the SY pedal. I haven't had a chance to check it out very much yet, and I would really like to. I've only tried it very quickly. I brought the Boss bass synth today because I only wanted to try one bass synth. But for those of you that are interested in a bass synth pedal, Roland came out with the SY1 pedal last year, and it's getting great reviews. People are really enjoying it. I just haven't had that much experience trying it out yet, so I definitely recommend you try it out. Brian is asking, is there a bass pedal to try as a first pedal? Any pedal can be your first pedal. I mean, if I say go with your inspiration. If there was something on here that you really liked the sound of, then try that. But I'd say if you were a rock bass player, a good first pedal would be an overdrive pedal. If you were a funk bass player, a good first pedal might be an envelope filter pedal. And for any bass player, a good first pedal might be the octave pedal. Because as long as you don't overdo it with the octave pedal, you shouldn't cause too much damage in your band. So Brian, yeah, just go to a store and try out any pedal and see what you enjoy. Okay, we'll give a last chance for any questions here. We're going to be wrapping up fairly soon. So if there's anything you want to chime in with.
Why don't you play for a few minutes while we let some questions come in?
Play for a few minutes. Now you're putting me on the spot, man. Working in a music store for 20 years, I never know what to play. I never know what to play for people. But yeah, if there's any final questions, please. I'll just play this little bit of a Thundercat thing that I learned recently because I really enjoy it. That is Cat. Let's get that sensitivity up. Gotta love Thundercat and his envelope filter. Woo! Okay, any last questions? I don't see anything coming up here. Oh, here we go. We got something coming up. Just getting the size right so we can read it. Clifford is asking, what bass guitar method book would you recommend for classroom instruction? For classroom instruction, there's a lot of great method books out there. The one that I used that my teachers swear by is a book by Rufus Reed called The Evolving Bassist. Absolutely fantastic book. It might be a little bit more advanced for someone that wants to get into jazz, but Mel Bay also makes some great bass books. My friend Jason Rasso, who's a bass player and bass instructor out of Guelph, he's come out with some really great books, so check out Jason Rasso's books. But yes, the Mel Bay stuff is great, and that Rufus Reed, The Evolving Bassist, is absolutely incredible. And Rufus will even teach you how to load an upright bass onto an airplane in that book. Yeah, it's very, very interesting book. That's what I would recommend. But, you know, talk to your teacher. We have great teachers at Long McQuade. They're teaching online lessons right now because not all of our stores have opened up fully and might be a bit of time before that happens. But books are great, but to me, nothing can replace a teacher. And having that relationship with a teacher, even if it's online, is a super, super valuable thing. When you find the right teacher, it'll make all the difference for you as a bass player. And good teachers have really great book recommendations for you. Okay, this is really good information. I'm a new bass player and I currently have an Ibanez acoustic electric. I think I know which one you're talking about. And I had my eyes on an Epiphone reverse Thunderbird, but I don't know anymore. Any tips on helping choose my first electric bass? My tip would be, think about who your favorite bass players are. Who are a couple of your favorite bass players? And then look up what basses they're using. Because if you love those bass players, if you love the sound that they're getting, then go for something that's going to be similar to that sound that they're achieving. Because if you have the right instrument, then it's just a matter of developing your technique on that instrument to get a similar sound. So that's what I would recommend. But yeah, Ibanez Acoustic Electric, that's great. Epiphone Reverse Thunderbird, that's going to be a warmer on the spectrum kind of sound. That's a super cool bass as well, but much more on the warmer end of things. But you just got to find the one that's right for you. And you know when it happens. Sometimes you play an instrument and it just speaks to you right away. It feels effortless. It has the right sound that you're looking for, and you feel inspired. So instead of going by someone's opinion of what they think you should play, I suggest going for what inspires you. I hope that helps. Let's see, Miroslav is asking, do you like bass guitars with an embedded tone capsule like the Dingwall or Dark Glass? So Miroslav, I think you're talking about active basses, basses like this that have a preamp and an EQ. For me personally, I pretty much always play a 5-string bass because I just like the versatility, and almost every 5-string bass has an active EQ. So most of the time, yes, I am using a bass with a preamp in it, but I use the tone controls on that preamp very sparingly, and sometimes I bypass them altogether and just use the bass passively. There are bass players out there that want the purest bass sound possible and don't want a preamp at all. They want it to be as much like a Fender sound as possible, and that's totally cool. I think there's room for everything. I think there's room for traditional people that just want to use a P-bass with no effects. I love that. A guy that just plays a P-bass with flat wounds and no effects is fantastic. Or a gal that wants to play an active 5-string bass with all kinds of effects. I think that's great too. You know, it all depends on how you use it. And someone is asking, is neck through and set neck construction meaning the same thing? And then he's asked, I meant versus bolt-on neck. So there are 3 ways that a neck can be attached to a body. And once again, there isn't necessarily a better when it comes to this. It's with every gain, there's a loss. There's no way around it, right? So if we look at the construction of this bass, this is my favorite construction and by far the most popular, which is bolt-on construction, where the neck has been bolted onto the body. And what you gain from that is, number one, a less expensive bass, because it's way easier to construct a bass this way. You also gain attack by having the neck directly attached to the bass via bolts. You get more attack, more punch out of the instrument. What you lose is a little bit of aesthetic. It doesn't look as pretty as basses that maybe have the neck go continuous, one-piece neck through design. And you also lose some sustain because the other ways that can be constructed in dovetail or neck through, dovetails also called set neck, can give you more sustain. So I'll start with the 2 extremes and then I'll go to the middle one. So bolt-on, less expensive, more punch, and easier to replace your neck. Frankly, if anything ever happened to your neck, you could replace it a lot easier with a bolt-on instrument. So it's very practical, and that's the majority of basses. Neck through is where it is a single piece from the neck all the way through the body, and then they just glue body wings on here. The advantage of neck through is you don't have a hump like this here. It can be a lot more seamless, but you can see on an F bass, they've done this beautifully, where they've carved this out in a way that even though it's a neck through, it's not a neck through, you still have a lot of access up there compared to if I pull out a Fender bass. A Fender bass will have this kind of block. You know, you can see that it's not smoothed out, so your thumb will just kind of hit this, whereas on the F bass, they've carved that out for an easier transition into the upper frets, which is a pretty cool thing. But with neck through, there can be nothing there at all. It can just be smooth all the way. That's neck through, and then so what you gain with neck through is more sustain. What you lose is the attack, and also what you gain is a more expensive bass because it's a much more difficult bass to make, requires a lot more craftsmanship, it's harder to do, so it's going to be a more expensive option to have a neck through, and you'll have less attack, but you'll have more sustain. A set neck is right in between those two. It's a neck that's glued onto the body. So instead of it being that it's like set into the body via a dovetail joint, that's also why it's called set neck or dovetail, because these two pieces are kind of made to fit together, and then it's glue that's holding them in place. So that's right in between a neck through and a bolt-on, where you'll get more sustain than you would from a bolt-on, and you'll be able to have that kind of smoother transition to the neck of the body. It's not as expensive as neck through, but it's more expensive than bolt-on. So it's right in the middle. And there's this company called Federa that makes really incredible bass guitars. At our store, we sell a few specialty bass brands like F-Bass and Federa. These are kind of boutique bass lines. And Federa, to really show this point, because about neck through and bolt-on, we've always kind of speculated about it to some degree, but they actually made the exact same bass, exact same specs, one bolt-on, one neck through, and one set neck, and recorded them all, same player playing the same stuff on all three of them, so people could actually hear it. So you can do a search for that and find that just by searching Federa neck construction or Federa neck through versus bolt-on. They've got audio files of each one, so you can actually hear the differences of all of them for yourself. Mark is asking, what kind of bass would you recommend for anyone with a small finger span? Thank you for asking that, Mark. Now, if you have a small finger span, I would like to tell you about my friend Mike Sobolski. Mike Sobolski has tiny fingers, and he can play a full-scale bass very competently, like extremely well. So even people, I hear people say, oh, my fingers are kind of small to play bass. Check out Mike Sobolski. He will blow your mind with how he plays his bass. He has incredibly small fingers. But the other thing that you can do, if it's still a struggle for you, because what Mike eventually did, he used to play full-scale basses, but he had a short-scale bass made for him, a custom one. But you don't even have to go as far as to get a custom bass made. There are short scale basses readily available. The Epiphone makes one called the EBO. Gibson makes those as well. And now Fender has come out with the Mustang bass, which they make in a variety of different price categories. That's a short scale bass. So if you want something that's easier on your hands, the ones to check out are the Epiphone EBO. Also, one of those Hofner hollow style basses. Epiphone makes one of those as well, like Paul McCartney used to use. That's why Paul McCartney played that violin-shaped bass, the Hofner, because it was smaller and easier for him to play, but it had a deep body, so you could still get a big sound with it. But also check out the Fender Mustang basses. They're short scale. They sound fantastic, and short scales really become popular, especially in the last couple of years. There's a lot of people buying short scale basses, so you can check that out. That might be able to help you. Brad is saying, I was thinking I needed a compressor to smooth out my sound, but you scared me away now. Well, I don't want to scare you away. I think everyone should try things for themselves. You know, I'm just an opinion. Try things out for yourself, but it can be tricky to use a compressor, but the best thing to do is to try it out for yourself. And the cool thing about Long McQuade is we rent stuff. So you can rent a compressor pedal and try it out and see if it works for you. Or just go to the store and try it, see if you can dial it in the right way there. But before you come to a decision, try it for yourself and just see what it's like. A compressor can add a lot, it can take away a lot. It depends how you use it, right? So give it a shot, man. I hope I didn't scare you too much from compressors. So that's about it. We're going to wrap up here. Thank you all very much for listening and for hanging out with me this afternoon in our little bass lair here. This was the basics of bass. We hope to come back again with maybe some more advanced concepts later on, but I hope you enjoyed this and that it answered your questions, and this will be available for other people. So if you're like, oh man, I wish Mike or Cindy would have been able to see this thing. You'll be able to continue to access it on the Long McQuade Facebook page. Tag your friends in it so they can come back and check it out for themselves later. I hope this has been helpful to you. Thank you very much. Enjoy playing bass guitar.